Welcome to USSO's Eyes on Events.
Hello and welcome to Eyes on Events, coming to you today from an incredibly hot and incredibly air pollution-filled Washington, D.C. I am nonetheless incredibly excited to be joined here today by a very esteemed guest, Professor Bruce Schulman. Professor Schulman is the William E. Huntington Professor of History at Boston University and the 2022 to 2023 Harold Vyvyan Harmsworth Professor of American History at the Rothermere American Institute of Oxford University. He is really one of our foremost historians of mid to late 20th century political history, writing books including From Cotton Belt to Sunbelt, Lyndon B. Johnson and American Liberalism, and the 70s, The Great Shift in American Culture, Politics and Society. That's one of my favourite books in American history, as is Bruce's co-edited volume, Rightward Bound, Making America Conservative in the 1970s. When he's not writing or editing books, he is a notable commentator on American politics, directs the Institute for American Political History at Boston University, and works as a celebrated teacher. Directing what I astoundingly read here are 32 doctoral students who have produced among them 27 books, an impressive tally. We're here today, however, to talk retrospectively about the RAA conference at the Junction, the local, regional and national in US history. Held on May 18th and 19th, At the Junction looked to examine, quote, the relations between and among different scales and levels of American economy, politics, culture and society. It accordingly featured panels addressing questions of scale in relation to natural resources and power, the media, the local and cities. Bruce, first of all, no doubt an incredibly busy year, but how are you today?
I'm very well, and I'm glad to be here with you, Tom.
Wonderful. Well, first, you're currently spending this year as the Harmsworth Professor at Oxford University, a very prestigious endowed chair in American history, established in 1922, which is currently celebrating its centennial. What has that experience been like? What has it been like getting to grips and finding out all the intricacies of British academia and American studies?
Well, yes. I mean, it is. We did celebrate the centennial last weekend with a symposium here in Oxford. I think 21 former Harmsworth professors attended that. So it was a great event and a chance to sort of reflect on the impact of this position, the changing experiences of the post holders, and also really in the way that the field of American history, particularly as it's viewed from here in the United Kingdom, had changed over time. To answer the question about what it's been like here, it really has been kind of both the experience and the honor of a lifetime, quite a journey. You really have fulfill a couple of different roles here. You do teach, mostly postgraduate teaching, but also, in the century since the first Harmsworth professor came in 1922, 1923, and became the occupant of the first ever chair in American history in the United Kingdom, maybe even the first in all of Europe at the time. American history has become a very vibrant intellectual community over here, producing all kinds of important scholarship, training a lot of students, so that the role has changed, I think, from being kind of the ambassador for the field to a place where it was unfamiliar into just becoming part of this larger enterprise and really having a kind of convening role, interacting with, learning from colleagues, postgrads, undergrads, trying to bring people together to advance a variety of different conversations. And at the same time, you also participate in college life. The Harmsworth professor is attached to Queen's College, Oxford, and has been since the late 1920s. And for someone who has spent his entire career in American academia, the college system of Oxford and Cambridge is an entirely alien academic culture. So, with a a certain degree of anthropological interest, I've also explored that. But it's been a very productive and stimulating year. So it's been great to be part of that history.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm sure I can speak for everyone within the British American Studies community saying that we appreciate all you've done for this community in the midst of what's been quite a unique year in British life. To move to the conference then, this is presumably an extraordinarily busy year in Oxford. On top of that, you decide to organise a conference. Why? Could you talk briefly about how you came to organise the conference, perhaps the theoretical influences behind it? The CFP, for example, cites recent work on the politics of scale, globalization, the global US heartland, and the middle tier of American federalism, all keywords in recent political science and histories of the state. I also wondered the degree to which this conference was influenced by recent political history, particularly the fraught and highly contested nature of the politics of the COVID-19 pandemic and COVID-19 restrictions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you've kind of put your finger on, I think, the main inspirations for the conference, which were at once historiographic and historical. So kind of to sort of go to what was been happening in the field, I think, this came out of a series of conversations with colleagues here at Oxford, and my kind of sense of my attempts to kind of figure out what were the kinds of issues that were of interest here, what were people working on, what were some of the big questions in American historical scholarship. As you and I'm sure your listeners will know, over the past 20 or 25 years, one of the most influential turns in American historical scholarship has been toward the transnational, the whole field that we now call America in the world, but also transnational approach to a number of different questions in intellectual history, cultural history, political history, the history of public policy, economic history, the global history of capitalism, and so on. It's no surprise that that has been a compelling interest of historians of the United States, I think, who came of age in this kind of this period of globalization that seemed to have defined, the periods at least since the end of the 1980s into the early 21st century. I think that, not to say that globalization has gone away, but in the last few years, we've seen more and more the reassertion of national and subnational interests, resistance to globalization by nation states and also by different kinds of regional actors. And so I think that sort of opened up some space for thinking about scale, issues of scale, not just on a transnational basis, but looking more about the relations between and among nations and various subnational actors. And then, of course, the big impetus in the last, several years has been, the combination of the COVID pandemic highlighting tensions between state, local, and national governments, the differing local and state responses to the pandemic. But also, I think, in the current politics, especially, around issues like abortion, public education, immigration, in which we're now seeing these subnational units becoming more and more important. So it seemed like the time was very ripe to kind of assemble people who have been thinking about these issues. And indeed, that turned out to be the case.
Yeah, great. And I'm wondering, as you say that, how do these new perspectives on American studies, given these new approaches to it, look different? Holding this conference in the UK, hearing from UK-based scholars, do you think this conference was any different for being held in Oxford as opposed to, say, Boston or in the United States?
That's a really good question. And I mean, it would be overstating it to say that it was sort of fundamentally different. And indeed, we had quite a few scholars based in the U.S. who came over to participate in the conference. And I think there is a real international conversation going on around these issues in the broader American studies community. But yes, I think that being here in Oxford and being outside the United States, that the UK Americanist community brings a different set of perspectives and a different set of questions to American history. To some extent, there is, a kind of comparative dimension. I think to some extent there is a greater interest in, how would I frame it, sort of maybe a greater interest in long-term continuities and patterns. I'm not sure why that's the case, but it has been my experience that those kinds of questions, longue durée questions, seem to come up more here, and that people are, sort of less captivated by very narrow chronological field developments. And so you can kind of think in longue durée terms. Certainly, when we put together the panels for this conference, we were struck how there were various sets of issues that scholars here were addressing at many different places, on many different chronological periods, so that people were interested in issues of energy, environment, and power, from the early 19th century to the late 20th, that there are questions about the interactions between different scales and public media across the entirety of U.S. history. And so I think that was something that was, for whatever reason, a different perspective that we got here being in the UK.
Interesting. And you cited there a lot, I think, that comes out from that statement is the variety of approaches to tackling this issue and seeing this issue within American history. So moving to... I would also, I just, sorry to interrupt, but I would also add that I think that, and, and again, this is, a more impressionistic and anecdotal from having been in, attended conferences and been involved in joint research projects with UK-based Americanists for a couple of decades now, but that there are certain topics or subfields of US history that seem to have particularly flourished here in the UK. Studies of America and the world, or diplomatic history is one of those subfields, which would be something you would expect given the and British-American relations, for instance. You might expect that, but also I think that studies of race, especially African-American history, but also studies of region, in particular Southern history, but also to some extent the histories of other regions of the United States, has really been, a very vibrant part of UK-based American studies for a long time. To some extent, it owes itself to key figures in the building of the field here who came to the field with that perspective. But for a whole variety of other reasons, I think there's been a sensitivity to those kinds of issues of regional difference and of tensions between localities in the nation that has kind of suffused a lot of UK-based American studies scholarship for a couple of generations now. That's great. Yeah, as you touched upon there, I'm wondering, on the 2 days of the conference, May 18th and May 19th, I believe, were there any particular highlights or surprises that you had watching the proceedings go on? I'm noting, for example, keynotes from Edward Ayers, as always an incredibly eloquent reflector on issues of sectionalism in the American South, for example.
one of the highlights was Ed Ayers' keynote. I mean, whenever Ed Ayers appears, he's such a great public speaker. That's always going to be a highlight. He is at once, I think, intellectually challenging and inspirational in the kind of material that he discussed with us. I think what was particularly interesting and useful about Ed's keynote, and something that then I think sparked an ongoing conversation through the rest of the conference, was that he not only addressed these issues of scale and the relation between local, regional, and national, and the way his approach to them had changed over the course of his career, but he also kind of put it in the context of how he developed his career, how he formulated his initial project, how he moved from that to subsequent projects. And so he gave early career scholars a kind of sense, builds an academic career and also really an intellectual agenda, a research agenda. And I think people found that particularly useful and exciting. And so I think one of the things that came up over the next day was not around these big issues, but also attention to how it, different to questions of method, sources, and approach, and how historians could better deal with some of these issues. And that became kind of a recurring theme of, especially, there was some really interesting insights about how he had developed projects, because he wanted to develop understandings of how things worked at a regional level across the American South in some projects, and eventually at a national level. But he wanted to have sort of the texture, the detail, the level of understanding that you might get from a local case study. So he talked about ways that you could try to finesse the differences between those two kinds of approaches and kind of take the best of those. And then at the end, of course, he introduced some of the digital projects that he has been involved in, and the way that that could provide whole new sets of data for historians.
Great. That's really interesting, because it keys into a lot of the dilemmas people trying to write these histories might face. The dilemma of being able to give a global or transnational vision while not neglecting the intricacies and context and individual lives of figures. B, looking at the global and the connected and the mobile, while not privileging solely, the powerful and the well-equipped and the wealthy, who are more likely to have that mobility. And C, to investigate categories of region and state and continent while not playing a part in instantiating those conceptions into reality, in terms of questioning and problematizing the historical usages of, rhetorics of region, particularly the South, which Ayers has talked a lot about. To conclude, then, you're obviously prodigious and well-experienced and well-respected scholar of such matters in American history. But I wondered, sitting there, what you learned from this conference to take forward into similar inquiries. Where do you see the shape of this field going in the years ahead, particularly given how some of these debates are really resonant in today's politics ahead of the 2024 presidential election?
Well, I feel pretty confident that we're going to see more attention to these subnational actors. And maybe this would be the surprise, because this seems old-fashioned or old becoming new again. Much more attention to, one set of actors in American public life that used to be a subject of a lot of sustained historical interest and hasn't, and that's been the states. Not so much the state, which has been certainly a subject that I myself and many others have been focused on, but the states, as in the 50 United States. I think that contemporary politics has, for better or worse, if you were to ask my opinion, mostly for worse, elevated the importance of state level actors, governments, universities, etc. And I think that that is likely to make people reflect more on the kind of workings of the federal system in the United States. And I imagine that that's going to be something of more interest down the road, given, the architecture of the current U.S. Supreme Court and some of the issues that are gripping American politics today.
Amazing. Thank you. I suspect the words Trump indictment and Florida will be particularly frequent within such discussions, as will probably some of the debates we're seeing emerging around electoral college reform and taxation without representation in the cases of the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. So very much discussions to watch going forward. Thank you for joining me today, Bruce, and thank you for organising what sounds like a generative and thought-provoking conference in a very unique time and setting, and best of luck with your remaining months in Oxford and in the UK. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.